Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Rybeck. I am the general manager here at House of Books in Kent, Connecticut, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the bookstore. I'm actually in the bookstore here on this Saturday afternoon, and I'm so happy to have Nick Flynn with us today talking about his new book, This is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire. Just a little bit about House of Books before we start. We have been open since the mid-70s. We're just about to celebrate our 45th year. And we feature literary fiction, general interest nonfiction, kids books, gift items, an eclectic mix of all of those things. So you can always shop online, houseofbooksct.com/bookshelves. If you're local, we can do curbside pickup. If you are not, we are always happy to ship. So please check us out there. We also have lots more events coming up. Just to spotlight a couple real fast. On Tuesday, we'll have Senator Chris Murphy joining us to discuss his new book, The Violence Inside Us. He'll be in conversation with Kurt Anderson. And on September 29th, we're going to have two journalists, Jacob Soboroff and John Washington, both of whom will be discussing their books about the crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. So please join us for those, and you can find out information about that at our website, again, houseofbooksct.com. After the conversation today between Nick and Danny Shapiro, you will have an opportunity to ask any questions that you might want to. So if you think of something during the event, go ahead, just click on the chat function down there, put the question in there, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. I think that's all for housekeeping. This is when in old times I would tell you all to silence your cell phones. Go ahead, silence them anyway. Why not? Let's all feel like we're in the same room. And I want to first of all express my gratitude to Danny Shapiro, who'll be coming up after a quick reading by Nick. Danny has so graciously agreed to be in conversation. She is, of course, memoirist, author of many books, most recently Inheritance, out in paperback just a little earlier this year. As for Nick, oh, and I should also, of course, mention copies of Nick's book are available through our website. Just go to houseofbooksct.com/Nick Flynn, and you can get a copy. Any copy you buy will come with this book plate that has, I just noticed like an hour ago, a little stamp of Nick's face on it. So, so go ahead, buy a book, and you'll get that book plate. Okay, so Nick Flynn, of course, is the author of many books, including Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, The Ticking is the Bomb, The Reenactments, which are all memoirs, and poetry collections that include Some Ether, My Feelings. He's also I don't know, he sort of works in many different fields, collaborates with many different artists, with many different authors, with filmmakers, with musicians. He's sort of does a little bit of everything. And of course, the memoir genre is sort of what he originally made his name on with a book I mentioned earlier, Another Bullshit Night in Suck City. This book, his fourth memoir, sort of continues the tradition of that book. It's a probing look at family, at memory, at the mistakes we make, at the opportunity for redemption and whether or not that exists. And it is very wonderful to have him here with us to discuss This is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire. Please join me in welcoming, and I always clap, and I hope you're clapping at home too, Nick Flynn.
Thank you, Ben. Ben, it's so nice to see you. I know Ben from Houston, Texas originally, and now was in Brooklyn, and now he's up here. And I'm really glad to be here with Danny also. I really, it means a lot. We have a real kinship with our writing and what we write about. And she's just a great person too. So I'm going to read briefly, just for a few minutes, a few sections, and then we'll get into a conversation. And thanks everyone for being here. The book is This is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire. There's a cover of it. Everything's backwards. There's a cover of it. It deals, the short, the pitch of it is that it's when my daughter turned 7, she began to ask me what I was when I was 7, what I did, and I had very few memories of it, and I'd never really written about that time. And the stories told her got more and more strange and more like a fairy tales, and and eventually I ended up bringing her back to my hometown to show her the places where the stories took place. And one of the places was this supermarket where my mother worked when I was her age, when I was 6 years old. We would go there at 5 a.m. and make donuts. One of her 3 jobs when I was little, and so there would be. Yeah, it was a mythic place for me. This supermarket, this large supermarket in our hometown. This was the first supermarket in our hometown. The town was in Massachusetts, not far from Connecticut there. So I'll read a few little passages, and this is all in my mother's voice. I sort of have it all in italics, imagining what my mother's thinking while she's making the donuts. It's called The Carpenter, the Fisherman, the Insomniac. She thinks, I remember the day the first man tapped on the window before the supermarket was open, stopping by for an early donut. Then came the others, men who worked late, men who worked early, men who didn't work at all, the carpenter, the fisherman, the insomniac. At first, all they wanted was a donut. It sometimes feels like a fairy tale, men tapping on glass looking for something. I'm asleep in a glass coffin. One of them could be the one to waken me. But am I the princess or am I the witch? The cop. I remember how it felt the first time the cop tapped his nightstick to the glass. I remember wiping my hands on my apron. I remember how I could not go to him. He was, after all, the law. I remember how he stood there, not smiling, not speaking. I opened the door. Like the others, I had to invite him inside. I remember 3 days of this, 3 dark mornings, maybe 4, until I grew to wait for him. I remember his nightstick, the sound of it, how it glistened, until I grew to want it. I couldn't stand there long. The donuts, after all, were browning. My kids, after all, were sleeping. The rats, after all, were hungry. In the end, he was just another worker. In the end, my job was simply to bewilder him. Diorama. Anyone driving past or sitting in their car in the parking lot waiting for the supermarket to open can look right in. Inside, it is still dark as outside. The light on the coffee maker glows like the lit end of a cigarette. Your mother passes back and forth to the bakery through the lit doorway. The men who sit in their cars, they can't help but notice her beauty, a smudge of flour on her forehead. The mornings you go with her, you wander the dim aisles, lit only by the slowly brightening sky, as if it were all yours, as if you'll never go hungry. The produce is covered each night by a thin white shawl, as if what is below is dead. The meat wrapped in plastic sleeps in little black trays. The mornings you go with her, you wander past the cereal you are forbidden to eat, past the soda you are forbidden to drink. That crap will rot the teeth right out of your head, your mother tells you. I spent a lot of money for those teeth. August. The mornings have begun to stretch out. Crickets weave their legs into sound in the tall grass that lines the parking lot. The leaves make that slight death rattle sound that signals the end of summer, but hasn't it only just begun? Not yet dawn, darkness pushing on darkness. It lives beyond the wall of glass. An airplane passes overhead, but you cannot hear a single person breathing inside it. That one light on in the back. She thinks, I don't want to remember this moment, when the idea first took hold like a match being slowly pulled across the flint. It's not a thought I want inside me, but there it is. One by one, the grains ignite, like this thought growing bigger. So many words, so many ideas. It sometimes feels like my head is full of flames. When did I think that having a kid would solve anything? Did I ever think that? Or did I just wake up one day and find myself here? And I'll read this one. It's the last one of this section. It's called Insurance Man. One morning, it's the insurance man tapping on the glass. She thinks, I don't want to remember the day a week or so later that I went into his office, even though he'd said specifically to stop by any time. I don't want to remember sitting across from him or the short dress I was wearing. I don't want to remember asking how much I'd get for a fire right after asking about a flood. But we both knew it wouldn't be a flood, that no flood was coming. I don't want to remember his smile or his hand in his lap, the one with the ring. Stop by any time, he said, after we'd signed the papers, even though I already had. I don't want to remember him in line at the bank the day after the fire. I don't want to remember his smile, how different it was. I hope everyone's okay, he said tightly. Something about him reminded me of how, after a few drinks, my mother would light a cigarette, then swing the lit match lazily back and forth in the air beside her. No matter how long she shook her hand, it wouldn't go out. Whatever happens, I will not become her. All right, that's a little taste. Now we'll bring Danny back.
Hey, Nick.
Hi, Danny. Hi, Danny.
Hey, everybody. It's just so good to hear you read and to be with you and to know that there are people listening to this conversation, everyone in their own space. One day we will gather again. That will happen.
Yeah.
No, we were talking a couple of weeks ago. I interviewed you for my podcast, Family Secrets, and that episode, which I'm so excited about, will air in October when the new season launches. But I wanted to have kind of like a different conversation with you a little bit today, with some overlap, because there's a limit to how literary I can be in Family Secrets. It's much more of a sort of, we're telling a story. And there was so much that I wanted to talk to you about in terms of process and memoir. And I was thinking about, as you were reading, something that I've said to my students often about theme, which is that theme is just a fancy literary term for obsession. And we don't choose what obsesses us. And, it just was striking me that you have mined this incredibly fertile, painful ground all through your life as a writer in every form that you work in. And I want to read back to you one of the many things I love about your work, and I really love this book, and I love having read it more than once. Now it's just full of such gems and wisdom. But one of the things I love about your work is that you always bring in other voices. You always bring in other wisdom, and so the reader becomes sort of doubly wise, like becomes wise, and is deepened by your exploration, but also by this kind of chorus of other voices. And so there's this passage from both yours and one of our favorite thinkers about trauma, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote In the Body Keeps the Score, "Trauma by its nature drives us to the edge of comprehension. Sooner or later, most survivors come up with what many of them call their cover story that offers some explanation for their symptoms and behavior for public consumption. These stories, however, rarely capture the inner truth of the experience. It is enormously difficult to organize one's traumatic experiences into a coherent account, a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end." And so this is my long way of asking you, your work has always sort of danced in a kind of mosaic, conversation with itself. It always breaks apart. It breaks apart, and then in the white space, there's this sort of generous room for the reader to enter. But it's not a coherent whole with a beginning, middle, and an end. And in this book in particular, you're actually like, you're flat out writing about and thinking about the cover story, and then getting underneath what the cover story was. So could you talk about that a bit?
Sure. I mean, that was so much. I mean, so much good stuff there. I had to take notes while you were talking. Um, one thing you brought up, the obsession at the beginning, um, and that most writers, rather than theme, do have these obsessions. That's what I said at the beginning. I think there's one of our overlaps as writers, you and I, like the obsession, like trying to figure out about our families, about where we're from, and what made us, and what that seems to be, if I can say, that seems to be one of your things that you've wrestled with, over many books too. Um, and I've tried to turn that obsessive thing. 'Cause I feel like obsession is like a. Excuse me one second. Sorry. I feel like obsession is like, for me, it's kind of it's a negative in some way, just because it does sort of take over. It takes over, and it can be, I think, destructive to those around you, like to just be caught in an obsession. So I really tried to like sort of step outside that as much as possible. So in my later books, like say my first books were really obsessive driven, and these later ones, like it just seemed like that mode would not, it's not good for like the long run. Like it feels like you would burn out on obsession. And so, I really tried to do, which also another overlap with us, I've tried to sort of find like another way. And it seems like the other side of that is, for me, meditation. Like to, rather than obsessive, but a meditative state where you allow things to just rise up more organically, rather than sort of like grabbing onto them and letting them drag you across a field. You just let them rise up, and sort of you welcome them, or you're terrified by them, but you sort of watch them and observe them. So that's that. The idea of the cover story from Van der Kolk. I know you interviewed Van der Kolk, which is I'm very impressed with, and love the interview. And that book is so important to me. The Body Keeps the Score. His idea of the cover story is funny. Like when I hear it, like that people come up with a cover story, like I think there's also that level of like, you don't really know that it's a cover story, that it's just something that exists below your conscious mind. It's like below the, what you could actually articulate. It's sort of the best you can do sometimes. It's like you sort of say the thing that it makes sense to you. It's like, it's a cover story to yourself also. Like it's also like, maybe he says it, maybe he gets into that, and it's also, it's not just the thing that you're keeping from others, but you're also keeping it from yourself. I think is a big part of it too. And it is, like he says, it's at the edge of comprehension. It's like, it's right at the edge of comprehension. Yeah, just the idea of the kaleidoscope, the nature of like telling the story. You call it mosaic. And I felt like there's a huge, I'm up in upstate New York right now, and I haven't seen this thing. I might not even want to go see it, because I think it's just more, it's better as a story to me, but there's supposedly an enormous kaleidoscope that you can enter into nearby here. You walk into like a huge room, and it sort of makes the whole world a kaleidoscope. And when I heard that while I was writing this book, I said, well, that's sort of what I'm doing here too. It's sort of these pieces that swirl around, and suddenly you see the pattern appear for a moment. And it's very beautiful, and then it'll sort of break up again and turn something else that maybe suddenly looks like a devil's head or something, and then it'll transform into a flower, into something else. That idea of the kaleidoscope. And you also said something about the white space. Like the pieces I read just now, I haven't read those pieces for during these virtual things. I've done a few of these now. But people ask me about them. People have asked me about them, like entering into my mother's voice and having my mother's voice speak. And it just seemed to me like the best way to sort of reveal that moment, because it really is about trying to understand her at that moment of her life when she's young, she's like 25, and working 3 jobs with 2 kids, and she has this house that she can't afford, and trying to figure out what to do, and she's having an affair with a married man, and so by setting the house on fire, she's able to it sort of solves a few problems, or potentially solves a few problems. And one of them is that he's a carpenter, so it'll give him a reason to be there working on the house. It's a very elaborate scam, really, and dangerous and reckless. But yeah, so I'll just leave it at that. But the pieces I read, because you mentioned about white space and letting the reader come in, those were very short pieces. A lot of them were just paragraphs about these entering into these different guys. And these were guys that I knew. And I said, like the cop or the insurance man or the carpenter, these were her boyfriends that I knew when I was a kid that I would sort of, get to know for a period of time when they were dating. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
It strikes me too. So often people, like readers of memoir, will say, essentially some version of, well, you can't do that. Then it's not memoir. You
Yeah.
know, y- and yet I think it's one of the, at least for me, one of the the gifts of having written as many memoirs as I have is that it finally and ultimately has allowed me a window into a compassionate window into um, the inner lives of my parents as I imagine them. You know,
Yeah.
we don't we really never have to, as adults, most of the time, think of our parents as anything other than our parents, as
Yeah.
opposed to as people. And I think that's one of the most generous things in this book. And I feel like tracking your work over time, and maybe that has something to do with going from the obsessive to the more meditative, is that there's greater understanding, which is so hard won, um, and so ultimately humanly important, but also literarily important, that this was that this was a human being, that all these things kind of that preceded you.
Yeah. It's a strange thing. Like I've done it with even the first book with Another Bullshit Night too. I mean, with poetry, you can do anything. There's no rules. I don't think there's a lot of rules for memoir as far as I can tell, but but I have some, it's like, I don't make stuff up. I don't if my, if my, if my grandmother made apple pie, I won't say she made blueberry pie. Like it just because I'll think it's important to figure out why she made apple pie and not blueberry. I might say I wish she made blueberry pie, but I won't like suddenly just suddenly have her making blueberry pie. That's her thing. Because that seems not respectful in some way. Like it seems like part of the job is to try to understand like why, that is the thing for them. Um, and with like the people I've entered into their minds of, I've entered into the mind of my grandfather, like there's relatives, like blood relatives. I feel like I have some access to that just because whatever is passed on through, generational trauma or through the DNA or through uh, just having been close to them. And, I have more access to uh, the way they spoke. When I speak, you can hear, I'll say things that my mother said. When I'm with my daughter now, I'll say things that my mother said to me, to my daughter. And so I just feel I have this access. And, that was part of the reason of going back to my hometown with my daughter. I went back on these 3 trips to see, and the supermarket wasn't one of the main things to see, but it was part of my, the limited map I had when I was like 6 years old, where things I could walk to. I could walk to the supermarket from my house. And my mother made the donuts there. So my daughter and I went into there on one of our trips there, and we got a donut. We got a donut and ate a donut. It just felt like sort of this, uh, you know, uh, archetypal moment. Like we're going to share a donut that, my mother didn't make with her own hand, but there's the mixer that she actually made it with, still there. Seems somehow significant in some way, and in a way that's sort of mysterious. It's you can't really say why it was important to do that, but I think that's important too, just for nonfiction also, to like actually go to the place, and see it, and to be in the place again. And rather than, memory is really good. I wrote a lot from memory, but then the things that were unleashed or opened for me by actually returning to these spaces was, I couldn't have just imagined. I really couldn't have. So, yeah.
Do you do you think, I mean, you and I have talked a little bit about this, but does, it's kind of a chicken or egg thing. Does the impetus to write about it create the space and the permission to sort of vault over whatever resistance you have to going back, say, or to, in the book you describe the trips that you took, multiple trips, to interview all of your mother's ex-boyfriends, when you were in your 30s, and you had applied for a grant, you were making a film about it. I know for me, there's always this feeling of, I really want to know this. I really want to do this. I'm afraid to know this. I'm afraid to do this. And the only way that I can give myself permission to is by getting the assignment. I mean, like, it's like, I'm not going on the journey so I can write about it. I want to write about it, therefore I go on the journey.
Yeah, when you say getting the assignment, it's interesting because I remember, I think you and I, our paths have crossed over the years many times. I remember kind of very close to the time when you found out about the DNA stuff with your dad. Like, I think I know you were working on it down in Florida, and it seemed like it happened fairly recently around then. Like, you just sort of you seemed very shaken by it. Like, it was like a very, understandably, this, like, suddenly a whole new world opened up. So, like, the assignment, like, I think things happen like that for me too, though. Like, it's not like like with this, like, those trips that I took back to my hometown were not planned trips, really. They were really like, I teach in Texas. I come back from Texas in May, when the semester ends. I go back and forth the whole semester, but I got back when my daughter was 7. I'd been telling her these stories about myself, and then I had a gig in Massachusetts. I think for the Mass Poetry Festival, and we didn't have any childcare, and I had this gig, and my wife was out of town, so I said, "Well, let's go. When I go to this festival, I'll bring you to my hometown. I'll show you this house that I've been telling you about, this hermit's house, which is like the fairy tale thing that started the whole story. This hermit that lived in the woods behind my grandmother's. I'll show you that house." And we went back, and it sort of just fell together. We ended up in the house. Like, the house was closed. It's a museum now, but it was not even open for the season. But we just sort of talked our way in and got to go through. Everything sort of happened very easily, like it was supposed to happen. Like, I went up to the door and said, "Oh, I used to know this guy when I was a child." And the woman who is the caretaker is like, "Oh, do you want to go in?" And I hadn't been in the house since 50 years earlier, like when I was 7. And then I get to go in with my 7-year-old daughter at that moment, it just seemed sort of like it was, I don't want to say meant to be, but kind of, like, it just.
Those moments actually, I think, create space for that kind of, call it whatever we want to, but magic, I guess, like,
yeah,
things just happening that then, as they're happening, really immediately have that feeling of, Joan Didion describes it as a shimmer around the edges, right? Like, oh, everything is so alive in this moment. I am feeling it all, and I know that I will write about it, but I stumbled into it.
And Shelley relates it to a fading coal. You get this, like, this intensity, but it's sort of like you have this one moment to capture it, to capture this intensity. And I think, but that's the thing too. Like, obviously, as artists, like, we're in the middle of a project of some sort. I didn't even know it was a project. I was just telling my daughter stories. I actually wasn't really writing, but then energy was gathering around it, and then so it just sort of I took her to the place that the stories I was telling her. So it sort of made sense. And then, once I started seeing and saw her inside the house, it sort of, but then it happened again. The next year in May, the same exact thing happened. I was home. My wife was out of town. I had a gig. We took a road trip. Next year, same exact thing happened. And it hasn't happened since. It happened 3 years in a row. And then that door closed. And I was sort of done with it. And the last trip, the third year we went into the house, which I'd avoided, that my mother had set on fire. I had driven by that house on our trips and sort of showed it to her. I hadn't told my daughter that, I told her that it had caught fire. I didn't tell her. I still haven't told her that, my mother set it on fire. That seems a little too much of a dark fairy tale to tell her. So, but we went into it on the third trip. We actually went into the house, and again, it was just like meant to be. We just knocked at the door, and the guy just opened the door, and suddenly I was in this house I hadn't been in for, you know, my whole lifetime. So, yeah.
And then that ends up shaping what becomes the book. Like that ends up.
That's like the structure of the book. It becomes the structure, these 3 trips in some way. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Is that what you're going to say?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's this other little brief quote that I wanted to just read back to you and talk about. Another favorite trauma expert of mine, Mark Epstein. You write, in The Trauma of Everyday Life, Mark Epstein offers this: the mind's primary defense against agony is dissociation. I mean, even just like, let's stop, like full stop. The mind's primary defense against agony is dissociation. And the primary motivation for dissociation is stability. In dissociation, the personality wards off becoming fragmented. It does this by withdrawing from that which it cannot bear. The shocked self is sacrificed, sent to its room for an endless time out.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that passage blew me away. I actually ended up going down this rabbit hole of needing to find Mark Epstein's. I mean, I've read a lot of Mark Epstein, but I hadn't read that book. And guess what? It's sold out everywhere. These are the times we're living in, literally, like a warehouse. I ended up being able to find it, and I have it with me on this little road trip that I'm on.
Have House of Books should put my book in the trauma section. Then we'll put it in the trauma section. Maybe it'll sell out. So.
In the but it's so counterintuitive in a way, this idea that, you know, it's a defense against agony. And I found myself thinking about what it is to write memoir, because like where it comes from different places, right? And different feeling states and different times. One of the things that I feel like I learned writing Inheritance, because I threw away hundreds of pages before I figured it out, is that, and I'm really curious as a poet what you think about this, that it's impossible, to go back to what Bessel van der Kolk was saying, it's impossible to create coherent narrative out of trauma. And so when we're writing out of something that we are continuing to experience as trauma, how do we do that? And so the shocked self goes to its room for an endless time out, and the writer sits down to figure out a way of constructing a story in whatever and however experimental a form. And I guess the thing I'm wondering is, because I wrote 2 books in which I did write really out of the present moment. Hourglass and Devotion were both written out of the present moment. But what I realized was the present moment wasn't traumatic. I could write out of that place because I was like an investigative journalist of my own life. When I was writing Inheritance, like when I saw you in Florida, or even when we were in P-Town, I was still in a state of trauma. And so I had to figure out the place from which the story could be told that wasn't that traumatized place, which is effectively dissociation. So just one last piece of that I would love you to address, which is my theory, and I know there are poets listening to us right now, like my theory is that you can write poetry from that place because it's not coming from it, because poems don't have to answer to coherent narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I also like to say, like in your book Devotion, though, like just by, for example, just by pushing into, the questions, like the trauma arises. So it's not like you're free of it. I mean, the trauma sort of also appears in that book many times. Like, it's not like that there's like, you're just, oh, this is just a present moment, everything's good. Because anytime you do the examination, you start to lift up the stones a little bit, and, you see all the creatures underneath.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, like, I mean, I've known, I mean, it's again, it's a thing, I don't know if you can even know it, but I've been told that I can have a dissociated affect at times, which is strange to me because it was strange to me until that was very helpful, that book. Um, um, the Epstein book was really helpful because it sort of like put things in perspective, like why, what that would serve, dissociation, and then try to maybe let it go a little bit, and try to be, I mean, the whole thing about, Mark Epstein is a psychoanalyst and a Buddhist, and his books are always sort of combine those two things. And yeah, and I discovered him years ago with Thoughts Without a Thinker, I think. I think that was the first book I read of his. And it really impacted me deeply. And then I sort of forgot about him, which is really strange, until I was in the middle of this trauma book and a friend gave me that other book. And I'm like, oh, Mark Epstein, I remember him. And then, that book suddenly, I tore, it really, really helped. It really put things in perspective. The idea of the coherent narrative, from the dissociation, how to find a coherent narrative. I think coming at this as a poet, primarily as a poet, I don't, I'm okay with a narrative that's broken, a fractured narrative, to have that be, to have it like the mosaic pieces that you said, and to let the reader sort of fit them together, and to have enough space in between the things, to have these sort of distilled moments that are sometimes benign too. Sometimes the moments are not, ideally you couldn't do a whole book of just shattered trauma. You have to have sort of some looking out at something else that is just sort of benign, that the universe is, most of our days, like you say, in the present moment, you just had a nice ferry ride over, I went for a swim right before this, maybe getting to be the last swims of the year, in an outdoor lake, so there's beautiful things happening, it says sound is on. Is that for us? It says sound is on. Saw your mic available now. Is your sound on too? I don't know what that means.
I don't know what that means. I think it's
Yeah,
okay.
I think we're okay.
Yeah.
Maybe someone else had their mic on the side or something. Disregard. Okay.
Oh, okay. Good.
We'll disregard that. So we get little messages from the ether. Yeah. So yeah, I guess I don't seek, I don't think this one doesn't have a coherent narrative to it, in a way either. Sort of, it is it's also very much in the moment too, your books too. It is in the moment, but that moment for me was like you saying, for Inheritance was it was a traumatic moment. There was suddenly this realization, this sort of floor dropping out from me, much like with Inheritance for you. And, just seeing something that I'd known for a long time. I'd known my mother I'd heard the story of my mother setting our house. I knew our house caught fire. I knew when I was 35 that that's very likely she set the house on fire. But I didn't really take in what that meant until I began this book, until my daughter turned the age I was, really. That's when it hit me that was, a wildly reckless thing to do. That you don't set a house on fire with a kid in it, with two kids in it. That would be, and it sort of said something about my mom. I knew my mother was reckless, in many ways, and I have my own recklessness, which I document in this book also. But to sort of see that, and a lot of it was to try to come to terms with that recklessness in my mother and in myself too. I think. That was a big part of it. So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How do you feel when people say to you, or maybe they don't say it to you, they say it to me a lot. That must have been so cathartic writing that book.
Well, I always, I go back to this thing. I don't really say, I mean, I hope it's cathartic for them to
Right.
read the book. you know, like, because it's not what, like I say, like Aristotle didn't say that it would be cathartic for the writer, the maker of the book, of the plays. Like he didn't say like that. He didn't talk about the makers of the plays, like whether it was cathartic for them. I mean, most of them were all military people, right, coming back from the war. You know, from that. And they're writing in order to deal with their trauma. I mean, according to some theories, the trauma just in the culture from this war culture. You know, a culture that was continuously at war, much like we are now. You know, there's those great books, the Theater of War, and what's his name, Brian, the guy that does the Theater of War stuff, like goes over that. It's really amazing work. You look up Theater of War stuff. But yeah, so I think it's, you know, like making the books, to me, it doesn't feel cathartic. It feels very dangerous, and I have to take care of myself, like really quite a bit. I have to do a lot to sort of be in shape in order to write the books, and especially when I'm in the middle of a project. I have to be really careful because it's psychically difficult. So I would just suggest that. I suggest that to my writers, like really do the things you need to do to be in shape to do it. Stanley Kunis had said that, like if you read a poem that you really love and you want to figure out how to write that poem, you have to become the person that can write that poem. It's not just a craft issue. It's like you have to change your whole life in order to do it. And for me, it means like really working against like some things that are in my family. I mean, my family is, you know, we have a long history of like sort of destructive and self-destructive behaviors and recklessness and dissociation and addiction and, you know, among other things too. I mean, those are the sort of maybe the shadowy things, but then there's also, you know, there's some good aspects also. But, you know, try to sort of like not water the darker aspects, you know, and try to sort of just nurture the lighter ones. So,
Yeah. I mean, that whole notion as a writer of like having to essentially get in shape, right? It's like
yeah.
The way an athlete needs to get in shape for, you know, certain kinds of, you know,
Yeah.
marathons or sporting events, like to just be that,
Yeah.
to be that person, who can do that.
I see it with my wife. My wife's an actor, and sometimes she does stuff, you know, theater stuff. And, you know, the theater it's a 2-hour performance or an hour and a half performance at night. But basically, whenever she's doing that, like the entire day is to get in shape to do those hours. I mean, it's not like you just can do like whatever. You just sit and, you know, eat Doritos and, you know, watch Schitt's Creek or something all day and then just jump on stage. I mean, you know, the sort of things you have to do to be in shape to do that. And I think that's for writing too. Like I you know, my good writing time in a day is about an hour of like really good writing time. And a lot of the rest of the time is just getting in shape to write for that hour, you know, doing whatever I have to do, meditation and yoga, move around, talk to friends, go to a 12-step meeting, go to therapy, you know, all the stuff, you know, so.
Yeah. For that hour.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for that 1 hour. Yeah, for that 1 hour.
Allow for that hour to be possible.
Yeah. And if I don't, then yeah, it probably won't go well that hour. So.
Yeah. Or it won't happen at all. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've got some questions. So I think let's open it up to questions. Here's one from Mary. Nick, you mentioned your grandfather a few times. Was he a stabilizing influence in your life?
That's a big question. Yeah, it's really hard to say. Like my mother's father, they'd be my mother's father, and they had a complicated relationship. And it was stabilizing in some ways. I mean, he did a lot of good things for us. Like we were very broke growing up with my mother in our town. We were probably one of the poorer families in the town. And my grandfather was probably one of the richer people in the town. So it was a very strange sort of class thing. And my mother grew up with money, and then she just like left it, and just for whatever reason, we were just broke. But he would do things like, so we were broke, but he would like, you know, I kind of wished he had done things like for my mother more, but I'm not sure they had such a complicated relationship. Like I kind of wish that he had done more for her, like, you know, put her through college or just done something that would really advance her and get her on her feet. But he did stuff for us, like got us like tennis lessons. So we were like totally broken. We'd wear like these little white sweaters and stuff and go play tennis. Where our sneakers were really janky and like it was strange. So like strange thing. I go skiing with him. So skiing tennis, like really sort of like class-based things that I learned how to do. But it was strange. It was strange. It really sort of set up something for my the whole life, really. But to think about sort of class issues, really, in that sense.
That reminds me too. I mean, you've talked about that feeling of your family being in Scituate for. Did I say that right?
Scituate, yeah,
Scituate.
Perfect, yeah.
For a pretty long time, for generations, but not feeling like you belonged. And like hearing that anecdote about the tennis, like it sort of makes perfect sense. There's this split between these different kinds of lives, the privileged life and the life that you were living with your mom. And I wonder whether that tension is also, I mean, who knows what makes us writers? Who knows, but most writers that I ever talk to about this, myself very much included, really never feel like we belong.
Mm-hmm.
And that like sort of non-belonging is part of what is the tension or the yearning, not to belong, but just to make sense of things.
Yeah, to be sort of always on the outside, sort of looking at something. It did. I mean, my mother set me up, if that's what it takes to be a writer or an artist. She did set us up for that. Like, it was a very Irish Catholic town, and her mother was my father was Irish Catholic. My grandmother her mother was Irish Catholic, but she just sort of broke. We didn't do any. We went to a vaguely Protestant church for like a minute, and so we weren't like part of that community. She was a young single woman dating people in our town in the 60s. I mean, it was like really sort of not like, it wasn't like, like in the early 60s, like through it, like when it was really not a thing that happened. I didn't know any other kids who were divorced, who came from, were raised by a single mother, and we were broke. And so we were definitely on the outside in this way. But it did lead us to do these things, which I'm grateful for too. Like my brother and I ended up sort of taking over the whole neighborhood and like mowing all the lawns and delivering all the papers, like we just did all the work, in the town, in our neighborhood. And we deliver, we'd mow the lawns of like, a kid I'd go to school would just be sitting on the porch or something while I'd be mowing the lawn, stuff like that. So, yeah.
There's an interesting comment here from Jane, who says, subconsciously, your grandfather might have been reinforcing the difference to undermine your mother. Do you think that that's, like reinforcing the difference by like the tennis lessons and the...
Yeah, I mean, he was a complicated guy. Like he was kind of, he was really, really complicated guy in a way that's like still a mystery to me, like exactly what he was thinking. He inherited a lot of money, and he just sort of went through, because his father he was in the wool business, and the wool business in like, the early part of the 20th century, it was a big business. It was like and all the wars, like they made a lot of money during the wars. Soldiers' uniforms were made out of wool. And then by the time like I was around, like, polyester or whatever, synthetic fabrics had come in. So the war, like when, in the next wars, it was all synthetic fabrics. It wasn't wool, like Vietnam. By the time Vietnam, it was all like synthetic fabrics. And my grandfather just sort of went through the money. He just sort of like had a ton of money and just sort of like had an office, and just like, it just sort of, and he had an image of himself as being a businessman, but he didn't really do businessman stuff. Like he just sort of, the money sort of went away, but he wouldn't like, it was strange. He had a lot of money, and it just, by the time he died, it was like, he had no money. So the money just sort of went away. So, yeah.
Well, that's self-destructiveness, right?
Yeah. And he was also an alcoholic. Yeah. He was an alcoholic. My mother's mother was an alcoholic. Like there was a lot of alcoholism. Yeah. So
here's another question. As a mother to almost 10-year-old twin boys, who also tells them stories about my life as maybe family mythology or entertainment or both, I sometimes wonder if they will turn towards some form of art to recount these stories as they become adults. Do you wonder if your daughter will one day turn these stories you have shared with her into her own creative expression?
That's good. Hi, Steph. I know Steph. She's an artist. Steph is an artist and and a musician. Um, and yeah, I mean, I don't know what my daughter. Well, daughter will do whatever she does. Like, I'm not sure what she'll be. She seems wildly creative, and she always has been, just as kids are. Uh, one of the reasons I wrote the book was because our family was very, like, we didn't talk about things. There was just sort of that. Uh, from that generation or waspiness or something. My mother never told me about her childhood. Like, I didn't know really almost anything about her childhood, but it seemed like there was something uh, uh, very difficult about it. I mean, she was pregnant by the time she was 17. She, just left the house, um, and so uh, part of like this book and other books is like, or I can imagine if my daughter chooses to read them at some point, it just gives her more information. Like, she just sort of has more of a sense. So she doesn't have to like invent things. She doesn't have to like sort of come up with stuff. And, we talk, I do the same thing. I tell her these stories about that, you know, to sort of let her know where she's from and bring her back to my hometown. It just seems like, uh, it's I don't want to say I wish my mother had done that, because I'm totally grateful for everything my mother did. Uh, but it was sort of interesting not to have that knowledge and to have to sort of like piece it together. Maybe she'll have more of a coherent narrative than I will, and less fragmented, because she'll be able to actually see these, piece it together and see, like, connect the dots easier. So maybe, yeah, yeah.
So this is a question also from Mary for both of us. There is evident pain here, especially as you both described how you prepare to write. Is there some relief, a breath of phew, after you've put it all on the page?
That'd be go back to the catharsis. And yeah, I mean, I get a lot of joy out of writing. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I really enjoy the process of writing, like almost every aspect of it. I like, even in the midst of like wrestling with trauma. But I wrestle with my trauma stuff, like I said, in other places. I go to therapy. I go to have good friends. Various ways that I deal with that. And then in the writing, though, it's like it just brings me a lot of joy. Like, I really when I'm in the midst of like writing thing, I enjoy moving language around. I enjoy finding like music within the language, patterns that surprise me, describing something, trying to capture that in language. I really enjoy it. So, yeah, if I didn't enjoy it, I don't think I'd do it. Like, I really don't think I would do it if it didn't bring me joy. So, yeah. And I really encourage that in my students also, like, just to look, because I know when I was younger, I really thought that, like, it was all about suffering, that you really had to suffer to create that. And I think I'd feel guilty when I felt like sort of giddy and joyful doing it. Like, I was like, okay, this must not be good. Must not be the right thing. But I've moved away from that also, like moved away from obsession. I've moved away from just like using writing as some of penance or something, it's a creative act. It is this creative act. And it's like, I really, that hour of like sort of just being really in the language a day is like really a gift. So, yeah.
Yeah, I feel the same. And it is about the language. I mean, it's about that moment that, doesn't happen every day for sure, but that moment of just finding exactly, this is the tension of it, and the finding of
Mm-hmm.
this is what this feels like. This is, or this
Yeah.
is this,
Yeah.
this is what this image can convey. Or
Mm-hmm.
it's not an intellectual process.
Mm-hmm.
It's a utterly like visceral, and I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb and even say spiritual process, where it's like, I mean, I realized a couple of years ago when I meditate every day as well, that in my meditation, I was often looking for the like when my mind would drift, as all of our minds do all the time, it would drift to trying to find exactly the words for a feeling state. And then once in a while I would. And that satisfaction is one of the deepest satisfactions I think there is. So that's the few, I would say. You know, it's not like pain and then release and catharsis. It's the actual doing of it that is full of well, joy, satisfaction, contentment, lots of different feelings.
I like that. I like what you said about the feeling state, because I think the hardest thing for me is navigating emotional energy, like in writing, like sort of figuring out how to capture like what one's feeling, and you know, often it is in the, you know, the world around us, that in the images and the objects and the actions and the scenarios that somehow contain that emotion. You're in time and space, and something's happening, and how you you know, how that can be contained in language, so that, you know, without even saying what the feeling state is, but suddenly it gets transferred in a cathectic way to the reader, so that they have an emotional experience also. And it might not be the same one. Ideally, it won't be the same one. It'll be whatever experience they need to feel, you know, like Mary Gateskill had said when a interviewer was confused and said he didn't know how to feel about the characters in her novel Veronica, and she snapped at him, "You don't know what to feel. You're an adult. You feel what you feel. It's not my job as an artist to tell you what to feel." And I actually had that over my desk, like when I was writing this. When I write, it's not my job as an artist to tell you what to feel. Like, it's just to sort of create a space where whatever emotions you need to feel can sort of, like, you know, pour into that. And to have that. So yeah, I mean, that's a, you know, part of it too. So yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I think we might be at our hour. There was still something I wanted to ask you though, but I may not be able to. I may not be able to retrieve it right now. Yeah, we'll just have to.
We had a view. You got to listen to Danny's podcast, the Family Secrets podcast, because this will be continued. Yes.
The next season launches on October 1st, and it's 10 episodes, and yours is one of my favorites. So I can't wait to share it with everybody.
Wow. That's amazing. Do they dump all at once? They drop all at once, or no?
They don't. It's a rollout over the course of 10 episodes. But the trailer drops next week, and there's a little sound bite of yours in the trailer.
Okay. Cool.
I just want to thank Nick, thank Danny, thank everyone for coming on behalf of House of Books. Once again, to buy a copy of This Is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire, please visit houseofbooksct.com/Nick Flynn. You'll get the book and you'll get the signed book plates. So please place your order. Thank you for coming. Have a good night. Thank you both.
Thanks.